The Indian Civil Service for part of the 19th century, officially known as the Imperial Civil Service, was the élite higher civil service of the British Empire in British India during British rule in the period between 1858 and 1947. Its members were ultimately responsible for overseeing all government activity in the 250 districts that comprised British India and were appointed under Section 32 of the Government of India Act 1858, enacted by the Parliament of the United Kingdom. The ICS was headed by the Secretary of State for India, a member of the British cabinet. At first, almost all the top 1,000 members of the ICS, known as civilians, were British, and had been educated in the best British schools. By 1905, 5% were from Bengal. In 1947 there were 322 Indians and 688 British members, most of the latter left at the time of partition and independence. Until the 1930s the Indians in the service were very few and were not given high posts by the British. Wainwright notes that by the mid-1880s, the basis of racial discrimination in the subcontinent had solidified. At the time of the birth of India and Pakistan in 1947, the outgoing government of India's ICS was divided between India and Pakistan. Although these are now organized differently, the contemporary civil services of India and the Pakistan Civil Service are both descended from the old Indian Civil Service. Historians often rate the ICS, together with the railway system, the legal system, and the Indian Army, as among the most important legacies of British rule in India. Civil Service. Origins and history. From 1858, after the demise of the East India Company's rule in India, the British Civil Service took on its administrative responsibilities. The change in governance came about due to the Indian Rebellion of 1857, which came close to toppling British rule in the country. Entry and setting. The competitive examination for entry to the civil service was combined for the diplomatic, the home, the Indian, and the colonial services. Candidates had to be aged between 21 and 24, which gave everyone 3 chances for entry. The total marks possible in the examination were 1,900. Successful candidates underwent 1 or 2 years probation in England, according to whether they had taken the London or the Indian examination. This period was spent at the University of Oxford, the University of Cambridge, the School of Oriental Studies in London, at Trinity College, Dublin, where a candidate studied the law and institutions of India, including criminal law and the law of evidence, which together gave knowledge of the revenue system, as well as reading Indian history and learning the language of the province to which they had been assigned. By 1920, there were 5 methods of entry into the higher civil service. Firstly, the open competitive examinations in London. Secondly, separate competitive examinations in India. Thirdly, nomination in India to satisfy provincial and communal representation. Fourthly, promotion from the provincial civil service. And lastly, appointments from the bar. Uniform and dressing. Queen Victoria had suggested that the civil servants in India should have an official dress uniform, as did the counterparts in the colonial service. However, the Council of India decided that prescribing a dress uniform would be an undue expense for their officials. Although no uniform was prescribed for the Indian civil service until the early 20th century, the only civilians allowed a dress uniform by regulations were those who had distinct duties of a political kind to perform, and who were thereby brought into frequent and direct personal intercourse with native princes. This uniform included a blue coat with gold embroidery, a black velvet lining, collar and cuffs, blue cloth trousers with golden lace 2 inches wide, a beaver-cocked hat with black silk cockade and ostrich feathers, and a sword. Nature and role. The civil services were divided into 2 categories, covenanted and uncovenanted. The covenanted civil service consisted of only white British civil servants occupying the high posts in the government. The uncovenanted civil service was solely introduced to facilitate the entry of Indians at the lower rung of the administration. Changes after 1912. With the passing of the Government of India Act 1919, the Imperial Services, headed by the Secretary of State for India, were split into two: All India Services and Central Services. British control of the Indian Civil Service remained after the First World War, but faced growing difficulties. Fewer and fewer young men in Britain were interested in joining, and distrust of such posts among Indians resulted in a declining recruitment base in terms of quality and quantity. By 1945, Indians were numerically dominant in the ICS, and at issue was loyalty divided between the Empire and independence. The finances of India under British rule depended largely on land taxes, and these became problematic in the 1930s. Epstein argues that after 1919 it became harder and harder to collect the land revenue. The suppression of civil disobedience by the British after 1934 temporarily increased the power of the revenue agents, but after 1937 they were forced by the new Congress-controlled provincial governments to hand back confiscated land. The outbreak of the Second World War strengthened them again. But in the face of the Quit India movement, the revenue collectors had to rely on military force, and by 1946-47 direct British control was rapidly disappearing in much of the countryside. The All India and Class I Central Services were designated as Central Superior Services as early as 1924. From 1924 to 1934, administration in India consisted of 9 to 7 All India Services and 5 central departments, all under the control of Secretary of State for India, and 3 central departments under joint provincial and imperial control. Independence of India. At the time of the partition of India and departure of the British in 1947, the Indian Civil Service was divided between the new dominions of India and Pakistan. The part which went to India was named the Indian Administrative Service, while the part that went to Pakistan was named the Civil Service of Pakistan. At the time of partition, there were 980 ICS officers. 468 were Europeans, 352 Hindus, 101 Muslims, 2 depressed classes, scheduled castes, 5 domiciled Europeans and Anglo-Indians, 25 Indian Christians, 13 Parsis, 10 Sikhs and 4 other communities. Most European officers left India at partition, while many Hindus and Muslims went to India and Pakistan respectively. This sudden loss of officer cadre caused major challenges in administering the nascent states. Nirmal Kumar Mukherjee, who retired as cabinet secretary in April 1980, had been the last Indian administrative officer who had originally joined as an ICS, while the last ICS officer to retire in Pakistan was Aga Shahi, also of 1944 batch, who retired as foreign advisor to President in 1982. The last recruited batch of the ICS was in October 1944. Support and criticism. Dewey has commented that in the heyday they mostly run by Englishmen, with a few notable sons of Hindus and even a few Muslims were the most powerful officials in the empire, if not the world. A tiny cadre, a little over 1,000 strong, ruled more than 300 million Indians. Each civilian had an average 300,000 subjects, and each civilian penetrated every corner of his subjects' lives, because the Indian Civil Service directed all the activities of the Anglo-Indian state. Speaking in the House of Commons in 1935, former British Prime Minister David Lloyd George said of the ICS that it was the steel frame on which the whole structure of our government and of our administration in India rests. The ICS had responsibility for maintaining law and order, and often were at loggerheads with the freedom fighters during the independence movement. Jawaharlal Nehru often ridiculed the ICS for its support of British policies. He noted that someone had once defined the Indian civil service, with which we are unfortunately still afflicted in this country, as neither Indian, nor civil, nor a service. As Prime Minister, Nehru retained the organization and its top people, albeit with a change of title to the Indian Administrative Service. It continued its main roles. Nehru appointed long-time ICS officials Chintaman Deshmukh as his finance minister, and K.P.S. Menon as his foreign minister. Sardar Patel appreciated the role in keeping India united after partition, and noted in Parliament that without them, the country would have collapsed.